This book, as Dennis said, is based on a book that's forthcoming with Cambridge University Press, African Freedom, How Africa Responded to Independence, coming out with Cambridge. It's with a copy editor out of my hands. Free at last. I'm free now. So very nice thing. But this invitation comes at a good time for me intellectually. In addition to the publication coming out, I'm also involved in conversation in my field with other professors who have taken an interest in the idea of freedom. So in January of this year, I was in Philadelphia, and I participated in a session that was co-convened with the Francophone section of the MLA and the African Literatures, Languages, and Cultures Forum for post-1990. And we co-convened a session, and the theme there was decolonial paradigms and future freedoms. And from that, more conversation happened. So next month in November, I'm headed to Chicago, and it's the 60th annual meeting of the African Studies Association. And the session there with another set of people is Theorizing Freedom. And we have people from different disciplines involved in the conversation. So I did not anticipate this interest, and I'm really excited to have this opportunity to talk to you about what I'm up to. So just making sure this screen doesn't move over here, just this one. Okay, so introducing the book. There are two main ideas that I have to address in the introduction. The introduction is about 45 pages, so it's dense and it's got a lot of material in there, but I'm breaking it down for you and just giving you the two big ideas that I felt compelled to define and to defend. The first one is a very simple claim, which the book is based on, and it's the idea that national liberation did not deliver meaningful freedom to a majority of people in Africa. To me, that was, well, as I went on in my research, that seemed to me an obvious statement. And it's true that most people will agree with that, but I had colleagues push back and say, well, to what extent was national liberation about freedom? Was it about political sovereignty? Was it about self-determination? Was it collective in nature and not necessarily defined by the ideal of freedom? So when colleagues sort of pushed back on that, I went back to the archive and I tried to document what I felt intuitively was true. And so the first thing I do is I look at historiographies of African decolonization. And most African scholars agree, let's say, yeah, all the good ones, agree that, that decolonization and the movements for national liberation were not only about political sovereignty, but they were also about a grander project of collective redefinition, of shared prosperity, of transforming society. So they don't go as far as I do in saying that these movements were about freedom. The word comes up from time to time, but I could tell from the primary sources and from my intuition that there was more to it. So I went and I looked up the speeches by Nelson Mandela when he was on trial, and what landed him on Robben Island. So during that trial, the Riviera trial in the early 60s, his statements are all filled with the language of freedom. And when he got out of jail in 1990, I salute you all in the name of freedom, freedom for all. And so in Mandela's language, freedom is central. The title of his autobiography, Long Walk to Freedom. So that's one. And then I also looked up Patrice Lumumba. And if you look at his speech on the Day of Independence in his country, the word freedom is very important to what he says. Also, Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana. Not only his speech at independence, which I talk about in the introduction, but also in the late 1950s in Accra, he would convene freedom fighters and give them advice on how to go home and do this stuff, right? Organize a national liberation movement that would work. And I printed out the transcript of his speech to his colleagues, and freedom, or the word free, is mentioned 37 times. So I was able in the introduction to thoroughly document the central importance of the idea, of the language, and the ambition of a grander project of freedom. So that's the first thing that I had to do. Making a case for the canonical importance of freedom was something that was sort of foisted on me by readers. I wasn't that lofty and bold to start with, but I would offer a reading of a major work like Tukibuki or Chedo or A Black Girl for films, or, Armas, The Beautiful Ones Are Not Yet Born, or Life and a Half by Sonny Laboutanzier, or whatever. And people would say, but these are canonical works. We know them. Why are you telling us about them? So one of the reviewers said, Phyllis, you need to refresh our sense of the canon. What you have here is an argument that freedom has been threaded through the canon of African literature, and we haven't been paying attention to it. So step into the strength of your argument and explain that. So as I started to think more about the canon and what we consider central and how we relate to it, then I had a much stronger argument about the centrality of freedom in the creative works themselves. So those are the two things that I arrive at through a long and windy road in the introduction. I am willing to bet you that there are very few people who sit down and say, let me now write a book on freedom. This is how it's going to go. Most people I know who start out writing about freedom, who end up writing about freedom, didn't start there. And I had a lot of dead ends over time, not knowing how to navigate. The first thing was getting stuck on the idea of dispossession. This was the first idea that I had in the early 21st century, at the end of the 1990s, right in there. It's this idea that there was something intangible that African writers and filmmakers were talking about that got lost and they'd never get back. And I was fascinated by this dimension, but then I felt ultimately that it didn't capture the ongoing struggle to achieve something meaningful. So I felt that I was dissatisfied with it. That was one problem. So I finally worked that out. And then also the problem of migrating apples. When I first started this project, I wanted to have one example per chapter and to make my life easy. But I would sort my apples, Fuji over here, Golden Delicious over here, and let's keep them all separate. But they kept moving around. And so I finally realized that there's something about the interconnectedness of discourses of freedom that you can't really sort your apples. So I quit sorting them and I allowed them to sort of get mixed up. And then I was writing with fun, and I had fun. So those are the two issues that I had to resolve. But I think it speaks to the complexity of freedom as a subject matter and how people don't necessarily sit down and decide to do it. The other thing is a more personal thing, turning away from post-colonial theory. In the early, 2006, 2009, 10, right in there, I published 2 things on post-colonial theory, and that was sort of my goodbye to post-colonial theory. I have a long section in the introduction, it's about 5 pages, where I just lay it out. And I felt like I had to do that because my book was being sent to readers where, people would expect that of me. So what I say basically is that post-colonial theory will not allow me to ask questions that are fruitful about freedom. The reason being, it's backward looking. I talk about an existential hangover 50 years later. And looking forward, fighting to achieve something meaningful is forward-looking, it's progressive, it's proactive. People can get in the streets and organize around it. But post-colonial theory doesn't do much in that regard. So then, once I decided to be interdisciplinary and move in a different direction, I started reading social sciences, work in the social sciences, philosophy, economy, history, sociology. And this helped me define my theory of freedom. And then I also read extensively primary texts to try and get a handle on patterns and how they emerged over time. I think that when you see my approach to freedom in this book, the things that come to mind are, travel, conversation, and my peculiar life story, which is what leads to this autobiographical voice that's threaded through the narrative. So those are the sort of dynamics of the argument that you'll see as I present, that define the project. Okay, once I started to define the project conceptually and I laid out the terrain, I decided that there are 5 areas of narrative interest that I think are analytically useful. The first is the intimate self and the introspective gaze, the unfettering the self. I have a couple of slides on this and I'll go into more detail, but that's this turning inwards after independence and trying to take stock. Then we move on to the next level of complexity, which is gender dynamics and how women engage with the idea and languages of freedom. And then we move on to the nation and national dynamics, and then to transnational dynamics in the global realm. And then the last chapter deals with the spiritual realm. So these chapters are not organized chronologically. They're layers of accumulated complexity, and they come all the way back around in the end to a kind of intimate existential relationship. So I'll say more about each of these as we go forward. I didn't initially want to define freedom. Sounds very ambitious, but I realized over time that I couldn't avoid it. I had to bring some conceptual definition to the idea of freedom. So I decided on three types of freedom. The first is instrumental. This relates to freedom of expression, the right to organize, the right to vote. Instruments that can advance the cause of freedom. Substantive freedoms are choices individuals make, their choice of spouse, how they educate their children, things that can improve and define one's life. In a way, Amartya Sen describes that to define a life, one has reason to value. So it's not saying you must be democratic, you must be Christian, you must be XYZ, but the substantive choices of individuals to define their lives in a way they have reason to value is what we mean by substantive freedom. I introduced the existential freedom here. No one else that I read talks about it, but I felt that in African narratives of the 20th and 21st centuries, this existential spiritual dimension was indispensable, and it's throughout the work. So those are my three types of freedom. I argue that they're mutually dependent and they're interconnected, and that they all work together. So sometimes you have an emphasis on substantive freedom in feminist writing when women want to choose their spouses, and that takes the foreground. Or you have instrumental freedoms taking the foreground when it's about journalists being censored or whatever. But these different types of freedom are there throughout. Okay, I'll probably have to go quickly through these. I have slides for each of the 5 areas of narrative interest because they're chapters, right? So the first chapter, the intimate self, unfettering identity after independence. I start each chapter with a story. And chapter 1 starts with a story of me traveling to the Congo in the 1990s in between 2 civil wars and visiting Sonny Labutanzi's house. I was on my way to the airport, and what I found in his house on that day was his living room, and to the right, his writing room and his bedroom. And in his bedroom there was his bed, his writing table, and an altar that he had constructed where he prayed. And after I was honored to have this encounter and visit his home, I wrote an article about the altar, sort of understanding what was going on. But the fact of the intimacy of his bedroom and the continuity of purpose between sleeping, writing, and praying just really left an impression on me on the importance of the intimate self in writing, and how we're missing something so essential if we don't take that very seriously. So that's the story I tell. So I have excerpts here that I would love to read to you, but time doesn't allow it. It's better for me to talk anyway. It's less boring for you, and thanks for coming out at 7 o'clock at night. So in this chapter, I talk about the introspective gaze and this turning inward and taking stock of the self after independence. And I talk about 3 critics in particular. There are others also, but Frantz Fanon has a fascinating chapter on the lived experience of Black men and people. And he talks about sitting at his desk and reaching out for a pack of cigarettes and seeing that his arm is Black, and that relationship between his sense of self and his race is right there. And what I say about Frantz Fanon that hasn't really been said, I think, by a lot of people, is that the autobiographical self of Fanon in his work, at his desk, reaching for a pack of cigarettes, had such a therapeutic value and was so important for writers. And so this is an aspect of the introspective gaze that writers and filmmakers are picking up on, and theorists have underutilized, in my view. Ashish Nandi is an Indian sociologist who talks about the intimate enemy. And I love this concept because it's the idea of having within yourself an internalized enemy after decolonization is over, and the struggle to liberate yourself from it. It's a very powerful concept, and I think he defines it very well. Richard Bornson has a book on freedom in Cameroon, and he gives us this idea of nested identity concepts. And what he says is every theory of nationalism, or he's talking about nationalism in Cameroon, there's always the self nested within the idea of the nation, and these, the relationship between self and other. So I use his idea of nested identity concepts to get at the self's position vis-a-vis these other spheres of experience. I look at 3 texts in this chapter, which is not very many compared to other chapters. It was my first chapter, and it was the most innovative and challenging in many respects. All of these, there are two novels and 1 film up there, and what I say is that these are innovative narratives that are introspective and that use a sort of anti-conformist, dissident point of view from the individual to question the narrative of triumphant nationalism. So it's through the perspective of the self that one engages with this narrative of national liberation that didn't work, right? We can talk more about that during the question and answer if you want. I want to stay with time. The next chapter deals with gender and the engagement that women have with the idea of freedom. Oh, yeah. So I start this chapter with a story. I lived in Niamey one summer after I got married to BT's dad, a Tuareg from Niger. And we were living in the house with 2 other couples. We were in our 20s and 30s, right? And one day I was working on a writing project, and someone came into my bedroom, one of the people living in the house with me, and said, my husband didn't get divorced. I'm in a polygamous marriage. What am I going to do? And so the story of helping her overcome this unexpected polygamy that she had been tricked into taught me so much about extended family networks, how they relate to marriage, and how important marriage is. If you look at African writing by women, the theme of marriage and substantive choices about defining their lives, it's front and center. So I start with that just to show the importance of these issues for women's writing, which people who are familiar with the bibliography will certainly recognize. So, to my astonishment, and I would be happy to have anyone tell me if this is not true, I did not find any discussion of the idea of freedom in women's writing or filmmaking. The closest you get to a forthright discussion of the issues that interest me is a feminist critique of the gendered nation, the gendered quality or dimension of nationalism as a discourse, that it's masculinist, that it's macho, that it's male-dominated, and so on. So I start with that as a point of departure to talk about how freedom is very important to women, but I had to go against the grain of existing scholarship on feminist writing. And what I say is that women, first of all, from their personal lives as they enter into the field, knew a lot about freedom being complex and involving the intimate self and embedded in gender dynamics, much more aware than men were as writers and filmmakers. And you can see the impact of the arrival of women on men's writing later. What some feminists argue is that women talk about the domestic sphere as an allegory for the nation, as standing in for public official politics. And I say that's not the case. I say that women do use allegory and tropes and figurative language, but they see domestic questions, intimate self questions as very much embedded within a broader network of issues that directly affect their sense of freedom at home and in their intimate lives and within the nation. So I go against this idea of women's writing being essentially allegorical. In fact, for me, the best examples of the interdependent kinds of freedom you can find in women's writing and filmmaking. It's very clear to me. So that's that. They start out writing about their lives, and there's a sense of autofiction to start with, and it evolves towards a more figurative engagement with freedom. And to take, for example, Adichie's novel, Purple Hibiscus, the last on this list here, at the very beginning of the novel, there's a teenage girl laying in bed, and she talks about the freedom to be and to do. So the freedom to be is what I call existential freedom, and the freedom to do is what I call instrumental freedom. And it's very clear that this idea of being free to do things and the freedom to be a certain way is connected to what happens in the national square. And Adichie makes these connections between different kinds of freedom in a single paragraph. So, there's a lot of evidence for this. So we can talk more about that if you want later. Then the chapter on the nation was rewritten last. I sent a version of my, an early draft of my book to a friend who has passed away, Alain Ricard. And I hadn't taken into account South Africa at that time. And he said, Phyllis, I hate to tell you this, but if you want to write a book about the ongoing struggle for meaningful freedom in Africa, and you don't take into account South Africa, nobody's going to take you seriously. And I answered him by saying, well, I have a PhD in Romance languages. It's a lot of work for me to take on a complicated new country. And he said, figure it out, you must. So 4 years later, I go to Cape Town and I give 2 lectures, one at the African Studies Center and one at a conference. And it was so useful to me to interact with colleagues in Cape Town and to come back, and I completely rewrote the chapter. So this is a chapter that's that has it's very substantive. There's a lot of material. Obviously, I can't go into too much detail. But the story I used to get this chapter started is about going to Cameroon. I went to interview. This was my first trip to Africa. I went to Cameroon to interview Mongo Beti before he passed away. And I went there, it taught me so much about the importance of travel and conversation. I went there with research questions, fresh out of grad school, with my little questionnaire. We spent 3 hours talking to each other, but so I interviewed him, and what I learned is that he had been attacked by thugs who work for the president, and that he could have died, that he fell on the ground, they were kicking him, he passed out, they hit him on the temple or whatever, and people intervened to save his life. And I didn't know that, and that he lived with that kind of fear. So anyway, I learned that. And then I went to a roundtable discussion on the freedom of expression in Cameroon, and the editor of the newspaper was hosting this roundtable. And I thought, wow, things have changed in Cameroon. Check this out. I mean, people are attending this roundtable. Fabulous. I went to the Congo, where I visited Sonny Laboutanzi's house, and then came back to Cameroon 10 days later, and he had just gotten out of the hospital, and he had machete wounds across his body. And he didn't want to stay in the hospital because he was afraid somebody would poison him. And so what I say is that you go there with your research questions about whatever, and you come back with a whole new idea of what it's like to try and keep the struggle alive for achieving meaningful freedom. And what I say at the end of this story is that, and this is an argument I make in my my course on protest movements, is that history is made in the dynamic relationship between resistance and repression, how the state responds with violent repression, and what kind of resistance militants, activists, people are willing to put. So it's in that dynamic relation, and that's how national liberation movements are defined, in that dynamic relationship. And it was right in front of my eyes when I was in Cameroon. So that's the story I used to open it. So I honestly am not willing to take up ambitious topics without having to sort of, well, it's not being forced into it, but having to review the history of the idea of the nation was a lot of work. And there's about 15 or 20 pages in this chapter where I go and I look at the history of the idea of the nation, where it came from, how it's defined. And I started with Ernest Renan's lecture in the 1880s at the Sorbonne, and then I look at Benedict Anderson's idea of imagined communities, and then I look at Karl Marx's Communist Manifesto, and these different ideas of the nation and socioeconomic issues, of course. To boil it down, the main problem that people debate in this area is, was it a burden for Africans to inherit the idea of the nation because it's European in origin? Is that the problem? If they had something else that was homegrown, maybe they wouldn't have, been led astray or whatever after national liberation. Other people say no, it's the instruments of power that are attached to nation states as structures that were problematic. And I actually agree with the second point of view. I think that when you look at the archive and you look at the narratives, what was most destructive was how the institutions and the structures of nation states were instrumentalized by departing colonials. And that's what caused so much trouble in Africa after decolonization. But that's a very nuanced and long, complicated argument. Okay. I felt dissatisfied with just dealing with theory. It's one of these things. So I thought, let me think how I can bring to the reader's attention what really was at stake in these discourses, like I said in the introduction. So I compare and contrast Frantz Fanon speaking to his colleagues in Paris at one of those Congrès International, whatever, I think it was 1959 in Rome, where he stands up and says, okay, nationalism is visceral, it's masculine, it's muscular, you should get involved with your body, it's physical, it's intuitive. He's a psychiatrist, right? So he has this very kind of macho, intuitive, visceral attitude towards what freedom means and what engagement should be like. Nelson Mandela is the other pioneer of national liberation who I look at, and the performance, how the discourse is performed, and the deployment of the concept of freedom in that discourse. So Nelson Mandela, when he's on trial, he could be hanged. That's one of the options that the judge has sentencing him. He said, I'm prepared to die for this idea. And his idea of freedom has to do with rights and laws and institutions. And it's about equality. It's about Black Africans having a just share in the entire, all of South Africa, in the rights, political rights, resources, land, and so on. So two completely different uses of the discourse of liberation, side by side. And this is helpful for me to establish the parameters of what the ongoing struggle for liberation was like and the range of options, right? And then I look at narratives that, so it's a point of reference in my discussion of the narratives. Choosing just a few. One of the claims I make in this book is that the nation was the sole focus of discussion for the longest time. When you talk about social justice or freedom or national liberation, the nation state, the nation, national experience was exclusively of interest for such a long time. So the material in terms of criticism and primary text is overwhelming. I boiled it down to 3 types. The first one is surviving the gatekeeper state. And this is an idea that Fred Cooper, A History of African Decolonization, advances. It's an extremely compelling argument, and I'll make it simple, but he writes beautifully. I highly recommend Africa Since 1940. What he says is, the new leaders of independent African nations inherited gatekeeper states. The gatekeepers are the dictators who get the tools of power and who have power concentrated in their hands. And they're in charge of oil revenues. They're in charge of taxes on uranium. They're in charge of selling land to mines that extract gold. So the gatekeepers, right? And so what do you have? And I didn't know this when I first started, but if you look at Aikwe Ama's novel, The Beautiful Ones Are Not Yet Done, you have a clerk, fabulous narrative perspective for a novelist in 1968 in Ghana. You have a clerk monitoring the freight train traffic in the country, going from the mines to the harbor. And what you have on his wall above his desk is basically a map of gatekeeping, where the resources come and all the way down to the harbor. Fascinating. Same thing with Sonny Laboutanzi. There's a motif of the foreign powers who support our dictators. This idea of the gatekeeper and the foreign sponsorship of these dictators, right? So primary texts can really show how the struggle to achieve freedom in Ghana, in the Congo, and elsewhere is, in a way, first of all, trying to survive the gatekeeper state, to identify it, to deconstruct it, to explain how it works, and so on. So this is the first step in trying to achieve something that resembles meaningful freedom. During the 1990s, after the Cold War ends, there's a transition to democracy in Africa. And of all of the novels and primary texts I look at, Sissako's Finzan and Mongobeti's Trop de Soleil tout l'amour, Too Much Sun Kills Love, it's a novel, it's set in Cameroon, they're the richest and most interesting text in the chapter. Because what happens in the 1990s is people come up for air like, oh my God, the sponsorship of dictators is drying up. We have the possibility of organizing elections. And there's this sense of all of the sort of layers of complexity of what it means to redefine societies after 30 years of dictatorship. And these primary texts are rich with all kinds of detail about what's involved. And I can give more examples if you're interested and sort of break it down for you, but really very interesting layered narratives of how to redefine society after 30 years of dictatorship and what it would mean to transition to something like democracy. And then I have a last section on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa in the mid to late 1990s. I found this to be a very interesting case study in trying to restart the nation after independence. These narratives of attempted national reconciliation really are, the performance of discourse in terms of what will it take us to live together again, what's involved in trust, in disclosure, in accountability, in all of these issues, right, in terms of coming forward and saying what has happened, which is what the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's mission was, given by Nelson Mandela, who had recently been elected president. What I didn't expect and what hasn't got a lot of critical attention is the undigested anger. Steve Biko's family didn't go. They said, first of all, we all know what happened to Steve Biko, and we're not going there to hear the facts disclosed because it's internationally known. What we want is the perpetrators of those crimes to go to jail, and since we don't have any legal recourse, we're not coming. And so that's a high-profile example of undigested anger. Give us some justice here. And this is not to let the white people off, right? But on a smaller scale, they're interesting films, gritty black and white films, people with video cameras in South Africa trying to explain what it feels like to have undigested anger. So it didn't work for everyone. So there's this very interesting process of trying to sort out how to, achieve some idea of freedom that makes sense to a number of people. Of course, what you end up at the end of the chapter is this sense of the limits of the nation state as an instrument or as a tool for delivering freedom to a majority of the people. And so there's a vast discussion right now on the theory of the global south, et cetera, in terms of what the nation state can do or should do. But that leads me to my next chapter, which is the last substantive chapter I have. It's on global Africa. I start this chapter with a story about going to the Sahara Desert for the first time. So I arrive in Niger. First, I didn't want to go. It's a long story. I can't tell you the whole thing. But first, I didn't want to go. And I go there, and I meet the leaders of the Tuareg rebellion the first night I'm there, downstairs on the terrace at the Grand Hotel. And they said, where are you from? And I said, well, you don't really want to know. Clinton was president at the time, not as bad as what we have now. And I said, you don't really want to know. And I said, well, I don't agree with the politics in my country. And he said, turns out we don't either. we don't agree with the politics in our country either. So we start talking about politics and dissidents, and I found out what they were up to, and they offered to organize a trip for me to the Sahara Desert, which I did. I'm just going to take the elements that are relevant to the conversation here, more to say another time. What I found out as we were driving up this road is that there were graves along the main road, the uranium highway, linking the West African coast to the uranium mines in the northern part in the Sahara Desert. I said, what is that? And they said, those are graves. I said, oh, wow. And I slept in this room that the closet was full of rifles. And I went out into the desert the next day, and we had car trouble. And the guy said, oh, there's a village over there. We're going to go get somebody to help us. I'm like, yeah, I don't see that village, but whatever. So I waited, and this Tuareg came to help us push the truck, right? And so he comes, and we get going, and it's fine. And so we roll along, and we're having lunch, and he was looking at me like I was an extraterrestrial creature. Like, where did she come from? And I said, don't worry, I'm not going to set up Disneyland in this part of, the Sahara. And so this was translated in Tamashek, and back to me. He doesn't know what Disneyland is. He's never heard of it. You're the first American he's ever met in his whole life. So I was thinking, okay, 13 billion euros a quarter Arriva makes extracting uranium out of Niger. And Niger is at the bottom of the United Nations Human Development Index, in last place. So how does this incredible inequality exist side by side? People fighting for access to drinking water while Arriva is extracting all of this uranium from Niger. What? So the theorists talk a lot about inequality and asymmetries and the unevenness of globalization. I have a statement about how the Tuareg can get the sand, dust the sand off his tunic and never hope to own a cell phone in his lifetime. So our ideas of what it means to globalize Africa is very theoretical. I see I have 11 minutes left, so I'm not going to go into the theory too much of globalization. But intellectually, this was the most enriching reading I did in the whole project. Theories of neoliberalism and globalization in Africa are so interesting. I wish I could read you some passages, really interesting work. But Amartya Sen is a Nobel Prize-winning economist who wrote a book called Development as Freedom, and the thing that's most vital to his calling the bankers on the carpet in saying structural adjustment plans did not work, neoliberalism is a nightmare, is to say we need to hear the people's voice. We need to include the voices of the people whose lives we're claiming to help. We need to include that in the conversation of what we're doing to help them. This is, if we do that, then all kinds of things change. So to me, that's a very subversive and powerful and important idea. Jeffrey Sachs has a book called Ending Poverty. I have some issues with this book. He's a banker, he worked for banks. He's an economist who worked for banks. And he talks about the West helping Africa out of poverty by forgiving debt and making donations and aid and so on. And in his discussion of how poverty emerges, he never deals with the dispossession of their resources and their rights, which has preceded. So I find that this is kind of, it's a redux, or it's a new version of a former colonial mindset. But there's more to be said on that, and it's interesting. Anyway, it's useful. I include him because he does say, as an economist, that structural adjustment plans and what happened in the neoliberal era eroded people's rights and deprived them of all kinds of substantive and existential and instrumental freedoms. James Ferguson, interesting. He's an anthropologist who talks about globalization from people's perspective on the ground. And I find this to be very useful in thinking about how complex freedom is in the global transnational dynamic when you take into account the local point of view. And as an anthropologist, he really opens up the field and gives us a lot of material to work with conceptually in terms of how to listen, how to incorporate, and how to theorize this perspective to think productively about about freedom and social justice. Jeff Ellie is my new favorite. His writing on globalization seen from Africa is brilliant. And he says that what we need to think about in terms of rights, resources, and freedom in the global era in Africa is to set aside industrialism from a Eurocentric framework as a sort of major moment in historical time. He says it's a relatively small slice of historical time, industrialism. What's important to take into account is slavery, plantation slavery, and servitude. And he talks about the radically stripped down conditions of workers in factories, in mines, and so on, in this sort of untrammeled capitalist economy where people can just be, the situation of uranium in Niger is a perfect example. So his writing on globalization from an African point of view and thinking about slavery and servitude, I find very suggestive. Okay. I can't remember. I think I have just a couple of examples of how Africa is seen, how globalization is seen from an African point of view. I couldn't help but include precursors. So Semben's film, Black Girl, there's a fascinating scene towards the end of the film where Joanna, the servant who leaves Senegal and goes to France to work, commits suicide in the bathtub. And before she goes into the bathroom to commit suicide, she says, "I am not your slave, and you will not deceive me about the conditions of my labor, and I am going to choose to be free by not submitting to this servitude." And she uses the word, "I'm not your slave," right? And you lied to me about what I was doing here. This is the Joanna's bathtub. From there, you can just spin out all of the narrative developments that happen over the next 30 years in terms of the relationship to exploitation, to labor, to migrant workers, and so on. Very suggestive scene at the end of Semben's film. And then Jean-Marie Thénault's film, Africa, I Will Fleece You. You have two narratives side by side. You have images of timber going off onto boats, bananas going off onto boats, and people's cultural dispossession. So the dispossession of resources, natural resources, and the dispossession of cultural pride, integrity, rights, resources, access to books about Africa in libraries, all of these things going side by side. And so this is another motif we have in narratives about the ongoing struggle for freedom in Africa in the global era. If in the chapter on the nation I had trouble selecting examples, and it was very challenging, I felt like the choices I had for text in this chapter was like a slideshow of theory. Anything you pick. These films, Kapai's film Arlit, and Nugent's film End of the Rainbow, it's like a slideshow for theories of it's just extracting, resources, paying the people nothing. And there's lots of fabulous imagery of this ongoing pillaging of resources and what it leads to in terms of poverty and dispossession of rights and so on, and the struggle to resist it. Okay, this is a 21st century thing, but in African narratives, novels, and films, there's a new genre of dealing with neoliberalism and the limited options available for intervention at the national level. So this is a reconsideration of how it is possible to intervene in the old school way of changing the politics within the nation. In Chris Abani's novel Graceland, Elvis immigrates. He leaves Nigeria. He gives up. He says, we can't do this. It doesn't work. And so there are these narratives about struggling to survive and thinking about it in the context of a neoliberal world order. Ngugi wa Thiong'o's epic is interesting. He talks about banking, he talks about loans, he talks about how they don't work and how hard it is to recover when dictators have these tools in their hands. This is the last slide on global Africa. So it's a grim chapter. Of all the chapters, this is the most depressing and grim. And what you end up seeing is that When people are deprived of their instrumental freedoms, when the possibility of intervening at the national level becomes more and more difficult, the social fabric starts to fray. People give up hope. They don't have faith in institutions or in the productive intervention. And so you end up with civil war and people saying, we're going to resort to a different form of armed struggle, civil war. And so these are two novels that take up the issue of how globalization can fray the fabric of a society to a point where people decide to just have wars. Farah's novel, Knots, is a novel about going back and trying to rebuild after civil war in Somalia. But this is a very interesting subgenre in global Africa. Okay, the spiritual is, I just have a couple more slides, and then I'm going to play you a video real quick. So the spiritual realm is a short chapter. I'm going to have to, if you want me to tell you about that, I can tell you later. It's kind of like an epilogue, and I've struggled with why it took the form it did, but so be it. It is like a reflection at the end of the book on the importance of the spiritual realm as something that you see throughout all of these different areas. There's no way of sort of sequestering the spiritual into a single chapter. It's throughout the entire book. And all of these different examples have a spiritual dimension. But this is an opportunity for me to reflect back in a sort of epilogue on how it's been with us throughout the book. And then to introduce a couple of examples to differentiate and distinguish a few things. One of the examples I give is Okonkwo's suicide in Things Fall Apart. At the end of the novel, he commits suicide. He says, things are falling apart. I can't live in this modern world. And he hangs himself from a tree. And most readers recognize this scene. Even students, many of them recognize this scene. It's a paradigmatic shift in African culture. And the spiritual dimension is very clear. I consider metaphors of unraveling that are throughout the narratives that I look at. And then I talk about archetypes and different forms of loss and how people respond to the imposition of foreign faiths as a form of existential unfreedom. I end up concluding that there are three types of reaction to this dilemma that Okonkwo represents. Some people resist outright, which we see in Chedo by Semben. Some people are disoriented, which we see in Soni Labutanzi's writing. And some people achieve a synthesis. They convert to Catholicism and they find a way of being happy within this sort of integrated synthesis. And we see this in Adichie's Purple Hibiscus, for example. So just to briefly conclude, I think one of the things that I would like to emphasize is that these areas of narrative interest that I've talked about are analytically useful. I hope that people find that they, you can extend the bibliography quite a lot. There's so much more to talk about, but I think that these are significant and they're analytically useful and relevant. The argument is also nonlinear, as I said, starting out, that there's this accumulation of layers over time. And I try to thread that through the discussion as I go. And also that these different types of freedom work in a way that's interconnected. One of the bits of advice I got was at the end of each chapter, go through and say, okay, instrumental freedom, we saw these things. Substantive freedom, we saw these things, and existential freedom, we saw these things. So at the end of each chapter, I discuss the different kinds of freedom that are operative in the discussion in that chapter and lay it out for the reader. And so they're interdependent and interconnected. One of the questions that's unresolved and that I'll be talking about in Chicago next month is whether the idea of freedom is Western in origin or not. And I think this is up for debate, so I'd be happy to talk more about that.